Jack Show on Artist to Art. We are alive here at Chateau Orquevaux, so you can look out the window, and we're going to be live with Jeff Cote. So here is Jeff right over here. We're trying this, and if Jeff, you want to press request on, we're going to try it with multiple cameras and see what happens. So thank you so much for joining on. As I said, we're here alive at the Chateau. You can see out the studio window here. It's just amazing. We're here in Orquevaux, France. So let's get Jeff. Do you see? Oh, you just press the X button. You just okay. You know, these are the things with the technology, right? Running back and forth with the technology. So here, let's go over to the other camera while we look at the work here. While we look and see some of the work in the background. And go alive here. And see me. Where am I? There I am. And we're going to request on right here. We're going to see what happens. There, request to join. Get started. I think that's it. I know, I'm excited to requested. We're requested. And then we're going to have to turn off the microphone. So, turn off the microphone. There we go. Let's see if this works. Oh, turn off the sound. We're seeing how this works to have multiple cameras, multiple us, like this. Perfect. Oh, interesting. How's that? Yeah, we're on. We're alive. We're alive.
We're alive.
We're alive. We made it work. So, welcome to the experience of IG Live.
Thank you.
In person. That's amazing because we're in person, we're in your studio, in the Chateau, and you've been here for a few weeks.
I have been. I've been here for 3 weeks.
How's that?
It's been extraordinary. Because of all the COVID issues, we rescheduled 3 times. So I didn't think this event would ever happen. So it's pretty amazing. It's magical here.
What are you loving about it?
Oh, the location is spectacular. To be set in the middle of France in the countryside is absolutely beautiful. But the people are extraordinary to work with, to live with, and exchange ideas and creativity, and see what comes of that.
Oh. And so this is a very unique thing for me because I'm doing this in person. This is the first one of the series I've done in person. And given that, I've gotten to talk with you and about your work for a while now, and I'd like to know what makes your work here the work that needed to be done here.
Well, I came to the Chateau without an idea of what I would create, and I wanted to see what came of the influence of the Chateau and the surrounding countryside. I think stepping back and looking at my work over the past 3 weeks, I noticed a shift in my palette. Because we are, in the French countryside, but we're also at this time of year is harvest. So some of the fields are barren, some of them still have crop in them. So it's interesting to see the different colors. But also the blocks of land that you see driving through the countryside. The misshapen farm plots is really interesting. And that's becoming apparent in my work as I work on color blocking, and not your typical shapes, but very, very different shapes and palettes. So I think that's creeping into my work.
Mm. Do you want to show us around a little bit? We can
Sure.
Bring the camera. We can follow us around your studio, or you can hold it. Why don't you would you like to hold it?
Sure.
And you can just kind of point it in the direction. We can just turn this,
Sure.
and I can take this off. And we can.
Perfect. So these first pieces I did basically were just color studies and color blocking, figure out palette, what worked together, and I really like the simplicity of the shapes and the palettes in these pieces. And then if we move to our left, these much larger pieces were a continuation of the same palette really, with the colors oriented differently, occupying much larger spaces than the previous pieces.
Can you tell me a little bit more about like what's happening inside?
This piece, the piece on the left-hand side, with the small block at the bottom, I just titled the piece "Fitting In," and it's really, I feel as almost an outsider coming into this experience. I am not a formally trained artist, formally educated, but self-taught and was taught by a teacher as well, a private teacher. She came to the studio, once a week for 5 years, and this is where I've come in 5 years. So the piece really is representative of what I'm feeling like coming into this experience. Above I have very talented artists sitting next to each other, and me as an outsider, coming into the experience and hoping to fit in and participate in the creativity. The piece on the right-hand side is more really influenced by the chateau itself. Is a bit of a sunset and a waterfall, which is what we have here.
Maybe we can move the easel out of the way so we can see what this is here.
So there's an abstraction going on with the sunset up here and waterfall, and just the landscape. The rolling hills and whatnot that surround the chateau, because this area is certainly not flat. It's hilly and full of forests here and there. So the piece we have below, more of the pinkish palette. Yeah, it shows it very well.
Yeah.
This reminds me of some of the work that Soutine did. It reminds me of musculature and animals, because we're surrounded by pastures. There's herds and herds of cattle, milk cows, I would imagine, surrounding the area. So there's a lot of sinew and muscle and life in this piece, given the palette. So that's a great fun piece.
So it's really inspired by this like countryside where we're at. How?
Yeah, very raw and rough, unfinished, not formal.
Have you been going outside into the countryside?
Driving, yes. Walking. Most days I go out walking around the property. So yeah. And then,
Yeah, where do you want to take this?
if we move to, let's turn the cameras and move to the other wall.
We can maybe move. You want to stand over there? You want to stand over there? What do you like? Yeah, you can stand over there.
So
Stand over here, and I'll position this camera to look at this wall.
So these 4 pieces were done from an exercise. So each of the chateau residencies is broken down into 2 or 4 week periods. And at the end of each of the 2 week periods or 4 week periods, there's what's referred to as an open studio night, where the artists walk around and show each other the work that they've been creating during their residency. And one thing I discovered during one of the open studios is the concept of curation. A gallery was curated, and all of the artists participating had to create works on 24-inch square panels or canvases. So I used that and created 4 individual panels on the same piece of linen.
Take a step back.
Sure, sure.
I just want to make sure that we're in this frame here. Yeah. Just make sure you're in the picture. This is my first time doing this in person, so I'm like, how does this?
Yeah, that works well.
There we go.
Okay. So I cut one big square of canvas, 60 inches by 60 inches, divided it down into 4 equal pieces, and just started my abstract work within those 4 pieces as they sat side by side. As I got through the different layers, I cut the individual canvases into the individual squares you see, and started finishing them separately, not alongside each other. There is similarity in the palettes here, but I like the complexity in some of them and simplicity in some of them, and certainly I love the palette that's going on in these pieces. I don't know if the Chateau influenced these, but my style is changing in that I'm spending more time on one canvas building layer by layer. Sometimes frustrating, sometimes if I don't like the layer, I completely scrape it off and start over on the same piece. And I like doing that because some of the original layer still exists and lives through the entire process. So it's a wonderful process to go through.
Wow. And you were talking earlier about how like it's somewhat trapezoidal shapes.
Yeah, so I tried to make 24-inch squares, but my taping isn't perfect. So some of the pieces look trapezoidal, but that will be corrected in the stretching. My frame roll will create a 24 by 24 frame and a stretcher rather. Stretch the canvas, and if there's any white borders that are showing, I'll go in and touch it up to create a clean portrait.
Hmm.
And the edges of the painting will be hidden by a frame or painted over. You could paint the edges black or whatnot, but yeah, the misshapen square will be corrected.
This is all oil.
This is all oil.
What got you into the oil?
During my lessons with my teacher, she introduced oil fairly early on in the process. It was at least two or 3 years into my studies with her, and I didn't care for oil at all. I did not like the texture of it. I didn't like how it handled. I wasn't used to it, and I certainly didn't like the cleaning up. She introduced me to acrylic after that, and I painted with acrylic for about 1.5 years. And at one point she said, "Your acrylics are starting to look like oil. It's time to go back to oil then." So I did and fell in love with oil and haven't left it since. So I really like working with oil. It's luscious to work with. It's very forgiving. And I like the look of it. It's a great texture.
Mm. Let's talk about because it's so interesting doing this in person. We have access to your whole process here in terms of what's going on the table.
So these are the tools that I work with. These are my palettes. I basically lay down just a few palettes and paint with them throughout the entire process. Building color upon color upon color, and sometimes mixing them. A lot of times I use the brush and the canvas to complete the mixing process. Sometimes I mix the colors that I want on the palette, but more often than not, I let the brush and the canvas do the mixing for me. So I use tubes of oil, but also oil stick from Sommelier. And then the brushes, I just leave soaking in turpentine. I clean my brushes maybe once a month or so. I like how that looks when I'm painting. So those are the tools that I use.
And what's this new one you're working on here?
Years ago, I painted a landscape series, and that formed the basis of my first show in Chicago. And it was at the center on Halsted, an LGBT center in Chicago. And it was a very successful show. I hung 19 pieces in that show, and the opening night I sold half of the show. And it was all based on landscapes, abstract landscapes, somewhat realistic. So this exercise today, I just went back and recreated landscapes, the same approach that I created landscapes before. And I really like the process. You know, it's basically laying down materials with a palette knife brings out forms in landscaping. It's, you know, it's uneven, Mother Nature is uneven. I like the simplicity of the palette, but I always paint wet on wet. So it really pulls under the under layers up through the finishing layer. So this is a work in process. It might be done. We'll see where it ends up when it dries. So
what's the next thing?
Other work. So I do a lot of small work, studies really, to figure out palette and composition. And sometimes I turn the smaller pieces into larger pieces mimicking the same composition. More often than not, using the idea to create a much larger piece of work, but not replicate the piece. So these smaller pieces are all studies just to figure out, you know, where to go next. These two pieces are finished, much bigger. Not considered studies, but complete works. But I really like the palettes in each of these. I like the redness, the boldness of the red up against the Prussian blue and the cobalt blue. You know, I really like that contrast. And then this exercise, actually these two were nothing more than cleaning off an existing palette. I had paint left over on the palette and just started playing with brush strokes, and you know, they turn into abstract works, but somewhat landscape-ish as well. And then this piece, I've always been fascinated with Cy Twombly's work, and just a huge admirer of his work. And he did a series on Blackboard where he did nothing but chalk loops over and over and over again, repeating the loop back and forth, back and forth. So I wanted to create that and see what happened. What did it feel like? What did it look like? And in this piece, I put the first layer down with graphite, just a series of loops across the page. And then took CAD yellow medium and applied it to the graphite drawings. And what's interesting is because the graphite pulled up into the CAD yellow, it started changing the final layer into a greenish hue. And because there were different densities of graphite on the initial layer, it started creating shadow and depth within just those two layers itself. I really liked how that worked. So I left it to dry, came back into it with three different colors of Sennelier oil stick to create this layering effect. And it really creates depth and vibration in the piece itself. And I really like what's going on in here.
What is that vibration to you?
The piece comes alive. You know, it allows you to see both the front of the piece and the back of the piece, even though it's nothing more than a two-dimensional surface. But to me, there really is depth and energy in this piece.
And it vibrates to you? Like, what is that?
It does. I mean, the contrast of the yellow and blue itself, you know, because of the saturation of those pigments, it really does create a vibration between the sharpness of that blue against the yellow background and then the much lighter yellows on the top layer. But, you know, vibration, you know, it signals life. It identifies life that's going on inside that piece and outside the piece.
Do you see that when you walk around outside, like when you look just out the window here?
Oh, sure.
What do you see when you look out?
Oh, there's different degrees of depth, and the color and light create the instance of depth and shadow and life. There's certainly a tremendous amount of life looking out the window.
Yeah, show us what you see when you look out the window.
So the waterfalls, behind the waterfalls, there's a natural spring that comes down from the hills that fills these bodies of water. The waterfalls were put there to create a retention area. And then in front you see here a much larger retention area that is at the very end of it that you can't see is another series of dams. So this area is incredibly full of life. There's fish in here, ducks, river otters, I believe, is in there as well. So it's a pretty vibrant place to watch and see life thrive out here. And then just the forestation sitting around here is pretty extensive. We've been able to walk and hike through these hills and woods up here, which is absolutely beautiful inside there. So.
How does the vibration that's just happening outside your window affect the work that's happening inside here?
I don't feel that when I'm painting. When I paint, I approach work from what's inside me from an emotional perspective. I mean, there certainly could be energy coming from outside that I've experienced, on our hikes and whatnot. I don't feel that. I mean, certainly it's possibly happening, but when I paint, I simply pick up a brush. I don't have any intention of creating anything. I simply start creating abstraction, and figures and nature find their way through my work.
And you also did a whole series outside, right?
I did. When I first arrived here, I started with 4 large canvases, and because they occupied all of my wall space, I needed a place to relocate them for them to dry so that I can continue working. So if you look at these pieces, so these pieces were, this piece that we're looking at now was a replica of one of the smaller studies that I did, trying to make it larger. And one of the things I struggle with in making a larger piece from an existing small piece is capturing that energy that was used to create the smaller piece. It's very hard for me to do that. But in this piece, I think I was successful in doing that. There's some wonderful moments that you can see the energy is captured. But what's interesting, the upper portion, because it's such a large field, I used a series of numbering to finish the composition, but to draw your eye and keep your eye moving across that large field of color. So that's one method I use to finish compositions. If we look to...
What got you into the numbering system?
So before I became an artist, I was a CFO. So my life was full of numbers and structure. So that stays with me.
The numbers and the structure.
Yeah. It's hard to break out of structure. I noticed that when I started abstraction, I draw, scribble with a paintbrush on much larger surfaces than just a sheet of paper. As I continue, I find myself painting within those shapes and forms that I created. So it's interesting to see that structure still exists and still guides me in my work.
Wow. So what was that like coming from all of the numbers? Like what is that to you?
That was really hard to overcome. That took me a few years to leave that behind and realize that I don't have to have structure to create art. Because I have a tax and finance background, that was, those are incredibly structured.
The constant structure. So
you were just compelled that you had like constant structure.
Yeah, I mean, following tax law, following, financial guidelines, um, that was always in the back of my mind, that you had to follow these rules. So letting go of those rules is, a wonderful way to create art, and very, very satisfying to know that you don't have to have those rules around you.
What got you to like break out of that?
I don't know if I'm out of that yet. I still find myself back into it, but one conversation that I entertained here during my time in the residency is inquiring of other artists who have been formally trained, and I think it's a similar structure challenge. Because you have that formal training, does that limit more often than help you create your work? Do you have a list of should nots in your head when you approach a body of work, or even just creating a simple piece of work? Is there always a professor in your mind saying you should not do this? So I think all of us approach art the same way. There's history in each of us that might limit what comes out.
Can you talk a little bit more about that history? Like, has history also freed you to experience things in a different way?
I think in the past 5 years, art has enabled me to express differently. It's given me the opportunity to express what I don't think I have words for. So it's given me a language, which I'm grateful for.
Let's go sit back down. There's more here.
Right there. There you go. But yeah. Let's go back, sit down. Let's try this. See what happens. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. The over the shoulder. It's fine. It's hold it back. There we go. I love this about doing it live. It's just but what do you find about, how did you find yourself breaking out of those roles and rigidities maybe that you had before?
I think just the openness and willingness to let a very knowledgeable art teacher guide me through the process, and let me know that it's okay to not have that structure that is not needed to create. Just let it flow freely. And she used some wonderful tools. She used to teach high school art. One tool that she brought to a lesson, or several lessons, was to have you read poetry. And she would say, stop at any point, and then she said, start painting. And that was really hard for me to do, because, okay, what did you just read? What do you think about that, and how do you translate that into creating? How do words get from your head to your hand? That was the biggest challenge for me. It took a while. I had no idea. First of all, how much paint to pick up on a brush, for example, to start creating. So that was very difficult. But I got used to it and started to be able to feel and to, let that energy go through your body and get out off the canvas.
What was that like when it sounds like there was like a moment in there when you allowed it to go? Was it many moments?
There were many moments. I think it was a series of small steps that allowed me to get to that point. We certainly didn't start with abstraction. We started with, small still life, small studies, either, panel studies or, drawing, constantly drawing. And I don't remember ever leaving that behind and going directly into abstraction. And it's a really interesting, not process, but history. You know, how did I get to this point in just 5 years? You know, once I discovered that I was good at abstraction, I found myself landing in the ABEX period. Love the artists who created the abstract expressionism movement. Mostly the women artists, you know, Chris Hardigan and Joan Mitchell, and those artists are just spectacular. The men as well, the de Koonings, just extraordinary work created by them. Cy Twombly, certainly. So it's been a wonderful journey.
How do you find yourself working within that, working in the context of history and also your own history?
I still struggle with that. One of the approaches my teacher brought to the table was to introduce techniques and materials and not history. And she didn't talk about history until she started seeing me paint a certain style or certain way. And she said, okay, you're painting like this artist, go look at that artist and study that body of work. So that was wonderful in that over time I started to build up a knowledge of history, but only after I achieved that style myself. And certainly I wouldn't compare myself to those artists, but it's a great point of reference. You know, I'm thinking about how those artists influence what I do now, and again, like I get stuck in that ABEX period. I love that style of painting, and because I don't have a formal art education, I don't know what abstract today looks like or what it should look like. I just know that if I try to paint like a more contemporary artist, the old me, the art that always comes out in me, always comes out. You know, I can't change what's coming out of my hand. And, you know, to me, once it's done, it's very satisfying. So it's interesting, you know, to see the limitation. I think I have a limited ability or a limited body of work. I don't have a wide range, but that's okay with me right now. You know, I create to create. I don't create to sell.
What does that creation mean to you?
For me, it's a sense of therapy. It allows me to get emotion out of my body and onto a canvas. And to me, that what's wonderful using Instagram, for example. Instagram is a great way to document chronologically your body of work. And what's fascinating is to just look at my palettes over the past 5 years. It's just the darkness of the palette that was there 5 years ago compared to the relative lightness of the palettes now is pretty extraordinary, and I think representative of where I am or where I have been psychologically through the past 5 years in using art really as therapy to move through life. So it's pretty extraordinary to see that.
What have you found yourself working through?
Oh, childhood traumas. You know, I work with a therapist as well, and it's a wonderful journey to be on. But it really is apparent in my work to see that kind of anger and emotion come out in my palettes, and certainly figure work. Some work that I have in Chicago has some really striking figure work that is parental and child-based figures with some interaction that I did not intend to paint that are coming through in my work. So it's really extraordinary to see this.
Is there anything recent that you're like, wow, I didn't know that was there?
Yes. I was commissioned several months ago to do a piece for a client in LA. And it took us a few weeks to get through the contract language and finally signed it. And I started the piece. It was a large piece. It was 80 by 60 inches. And the client understood the idea of a commissioning an artist where they didn't want to have a lot of input in the work. They liked what I painted historically. They suggested a palette that they were working with, but weren't fixed with that. I painted the original piece and stepped back and realized what was in that body of work, or just that piece of work. There was a child in that piece of work that was held back by a stick figure that was to me it represented the mother. You know, and what's fascinating is the shape of the arm and the hand created the profile of the child, but all the while the child was being held back by the parent. But on the back of the child was more mechanical, almost like an automaton. Still a childlike head, but a structured and limited body. I sent the image to the client, and the client wasn't excited about it. I struggled with that idea of changing the piece because I loved the composition of the piece, and it still exists in my studio. I struggled with, is this the client's piece of work, or can I start a new one to satisfy the client? At the end of the day, I started a second one, and the client was incredibly happy with the second piece. So, to your question, yes, that energy comes out, and I stepped back and thought, holy shit, I just created that, and the meaning that's in the canvas. So it's pretty extraordinary to see that.
What do you feel when you look back at some of those pieces? Like you just look back even in your mind's eye to feel what it was to work through some of those things.
If we go back to the landscape series that I did in 2018, there were some very dark landscapes in there, and to me they were absolutely beautiful. But I saw the darkness in there, and it was my first show. It was, you know, really my first interaction with the public, putting my work in front of the public, and I hesitated in that, you know, I had to prepare a lecture as well, and I wondered what to say, you know, because I wasn't open with, you know, my therapy and open with childhood trauma at that point. But it's interesting that it came out, and I was afraid that the potential clients would see that that potentially negative energy in the work, but that's what drew them. I mean, they loved those pieces, and half of them sold at night, which is, I guess, unheard of in a gallery situation. It's wonderful to see that energy make it on my body onto a canvas. It's wonderful to see that body of work accepted and admired and purchased by clients. And I'm starting to realize that everybody has that kind of trauma at some level in their bodies and from childhood, and they recognize that, and you know, these pieces are reflective of that.
Is there a level of like unconscious like acknowledgement that you think is like happening when other people see that same sort of energy?
I think there is, and I'm thinking back about the individuals who bought the individual pieces, and I know there is that kind of trauma. Now, I don't know all of the clients' backgrounds, just a few folks. So yes, I recognize some of it. Now that I'm a few years past that, I do realize that people are buying it because of that. You know, they recognize that energy. So it's really interesting. You know, it's interesting they fall in love with a piece, but it's interesting that they want to have that piece and keep that piece and retain that energy. You know, me, I'm getting it on a canvas and letting it go, but they are bringing it back into their home. So I wonder about that a lot. And maybe they don't see the negative. Maybe they don't see the energy that went into the piece. They simply see a beautiful landscape.
Do you feel at some point there's like an acknowledgement of that energy?
From the client?
Yeah. At any point in time?
For those close to me, yeah. I mean, my husband certainly recognizes it. Family members, other friends who are close to me recognize that as well. and recognize that that's driving what's happening in my art. And it's, I struggle with that, seeing a therapist, and processing all of childhood trauma, and eventually I hope it's going to walk its way out. But I've been relying on that and using that energy to create. So what is my work going to look like a week from now, a year from now, 5 years from now? Is it going to lighten up as it were? So that would be interesting to see.
It sounds like there's like something in there of like, will it be okay if it's let go?
Yeah, and certainly pieces like the Twombly work, that is certainly letting go of darkness and pain and whatnot. Because those are fun pieces to create. So it's apparent there's starting to be a shift in my work. And I wouldn't say starting, over the past 3 years, I can start to see, but I can see a shift in the work. So it's nice to see.
Do you think it's that there's an element of you've let go of certain elements from your past?
Possibly. Think about what we chat about in therapy sessions, and it's repetitive. The triggers the situations that created the triggers 50 years ago are the same triggers that occur today. So it's interesting to see, is there commonality in the recognition of the triggers or recognition or response to the triggers? Does that appear in my work? I don't know yet. I've only been doing this for 5 years, so I need more time to see. What do you see in the work now that you've become an insider?
I think the more that I look at your work, the more that I see now. I think that's the interesting thing about like getting to know the artists themselves and spending time with the work. I think the more that I'm like in here and looking at the art of the walls and really just getting to sit with it, I think that's a really beautiful thing. That's a place to sit and consider different ideas that you've placed into it. I guess that's a pretty rare thing to be able to have white walls in such a beautiful setting and have time and space to just have a beautiful couch and just sit and look at work on the walls. But I'm just happy to get to experience that with you. Since the last year and a half, I don't feel like I've gotten to do that with a lot of other artists. So it's so for me, it's just a beautiful having talked to so many artists about their work, but now getting to see it in the 3 dimensions and perspective and take a step in. I think that's like the work on the wall with the circles. It's like very much vibrating to me and moving, and I think that's in the depth of it. The translucency, and being able to like play of the eye is maybe it might be missed in a photograph, it might not, but there's a certain play of the eye that I think is really intriguing me. I mean, just for instance.
Yeah.
For instance, I think like we're here for you're here for another week and a half.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the 3 weeks that I've been here, I've created 36 pieces, which include the small studies that we did, but 36 pieces of work in 3.5 weeks or 3 weeks. So it's pretty extraordinary.
I mean, you're waking up every morning at a crazy early hour by the time I'm going to bed.
We have different schedules, but yeah, that's when I'm creative, is early morning until early afternoon.
And we've met here at this in-between time.
Exactly.
we've met at the exact time when our schedules cross paths. I think that's a fascinating thing. Do you want to say anything more about your experience over the last few weeks of being here?
It's been an incredible journey, just great energy, meeting new people and working with people, and hopefully developing as an artist, continuing to develop as an artist for all of us. So it's been an extraordinary adventure. And the Chateau Orquevaux, this residency program is like a fairy tale. I mean, first of all, the setting is fairy tale-like, but it's an extraordinary opportunity to be part of.
That's for sure. living in a fairy tale here in a fairy tale land and beautiful French countryside outside. We're right now on the 3rd floor of the chateau, and you're living on the 2nd floor.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And you're on the 4th.
I'm on the 4th and got my studio out in the stables. So.
Yeah, that's a great studio.
Oh yeah, it's an incredible space. So I think we are where are we? We're at a perfect time to wrap up. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. This has been very fun.
Thank you to all the live listeners, live people, all of the people around the world listening now, whenever now is, because it's just incredible to be able to share this experience alive right in the heart and the center of creation happening in these studios. So, again,
Thank you, Aaron.
yes, thank you. So I'll wrap up. I'm Aaron Jack, the Aaron Jack Show, Artist to Art, and I'll see you soon. See you soon on the next, whenever that is. Whenever that is, I'm here at the Chateau. So keep checking in. I'll see you soon. Thanks.